I'm Emma Edgecombe, National Manager of Business Centres here at the ASB, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. Welcome to today's Borrow the Expert event, created with you, small business owners, in mind. Sorry, Tim. Through conversations we've had with our customers and communities, we know that it's been a difficult year for many, if not all, business owners. We've heard the concerns for the future and the uncertainties about what tomorrow will bring. At ASB, we're committed to playing our part to help New Zealand emerge even stronger. It is our intention to walk the journey with you and continually look for ways to better support you. And we know as business owners, you have a fresh set of challenges to navigate through in these next few months. We're using our platform to have a meaningful conversation about some of the changes you might be facing to help you connect with relevant experts for free. And we're using our platform to have these conversations with some experts that we invited here today. We've asked Mike Cosman, partner at Cosman Parks, and Emma Peterson, partner at Russell McVeigh, to talk through some things that they're seeing and provide guidance on how to keep your people and others safe in a constantly evolving COVID-19 environment. Our event today will run for approximately 90 minutes. As an attendee, you'll notice that you're on mute and your video is turned off. Firstly, Mike will provide an overview of New Zealand's health and safety frameworks and their links to COVID-19 Public Health Response Act. Then Emma will provide her thoughts in a legal context, and then we'll work through some workplace scenarios where Mike and Emma will provide some ways to approach situations. Finally, we'll have a Q&A session at the end where Mike and Emma will answer any questions that you may have. For the Q&A session, please submit the questions into the Q&A box. Please remember, if you're having any technical difficulties, I can't promise I won't, at any time, message ASB Events Admin in the chat who will assist. You know where the bathrooms are, as well as your emergency evacuation route. I'll now hand over to Tim Dean, Executive General Manager of Business Banking here at ASB, to welcome you all today. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Emma. As Emma said, I'm Tim Dean. I've been locked down here in Auckland for 12 weeks or so. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you all for joining us this morning. Business is particularly tough for many at the moment. A lot of businesses that we've spoken to reckon it hasn't been this bad since the global financial crisis back in 2008, 2009. And then on top of that, we've got a vaccine issue to deal with, which it feels like the country's more divided than it has been for a long, long time. And so as these new guidelines come into effect and businesses are trying to figure out how to grow that revenue line and get back on their feet again, there's some very vexing issues around vaccination that you are all going to be facing, along with us here at the bank. So the aim of the game today is to provide you with access to some experts that will discuss through the various options that you've got and how you might tackle the problems. There's no one size fits all, but we are going to run through some pretty grunty scenarios at the end. And I trust that by the time we've finished, you've got more clarity as a business owner on how to tackle this problem. So I really look forward to the conversation, look forward to hearing from the experts. Back to you, Emma.
Thanks for that, Tim. And you're right, we're certainly in really interesting times. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our experts today. First, I'd like to introduce Mike Cosman. Mike is one of New Zealand's most experienced health and safety professionals who has worked in the field for over 42 years in a wide variety of roles. Mike was a member of the government task force set up after the Pike River tragedy and understands the why as well as the what around health and safety legislation and good practice. Mike is an independent consultant with a wide client base and provides advice right across the board, from specific technical issues to big strategic questions and complex investigations. Mike, thanks again for being here with us today. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Emma. My pleasure, and good afternoon, everybody. And really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you about what is one of the biggest health and safety challenges that we're all facing at the moment. So I guess COVID-19 is a wicked problem because it doesn't neatly fit into any typical box that we might think about for employment, health and safety or other issues, because it actually spans across all aspects of your business, your people, your customers, as well as your statutory obligations. So that makes it a moral, ethical, legal, financial, but ultimately deeply personal issue. And as with other things that we're having to grapple with in the workplace, like mental health, fatigue, or drugs and alcohol, which span work and non-work, it's also particularly challenging to deal with. And how far can we go into intruding into people's personal lives as well as into their work lives? So from a legislative point of view, COVID is impacted by human rights, privacy, employment, public health, as well as workplace health and safety considerations. And it's also an issue that's changing on a daily basis as we learn more and as government policy changes. So I think the key message for me is that we have to be adaptive, and we have to work with our clients, our staff, and our customers to actually find a way in which we can keep everybody safe, but keep our business surviving and hopefully moving back into thriving as things get into more of a steady state. I won't use the word normal because I think we're talking about a new normal. But from a health and safety perspective, it's not a new thing to have to deal with infection risks. So any of you who are involved in healthcare or you're a plumber, then you're going to be exposed to pathogens in feces and bloodborne diseases. If you're in the food industry, whether it's farming, processing plants or factories, then there's going to be health risks such as leptospirosis, E. coli, or Campylobacter. That's why we have the health in health and safety legislation. So I think the critical issue here is to follow good process, and a process that helps you to determine a path for yourself as how to manage those risks in your business. So as our health and safety law is generally not prescriptive, it gives us some flexibility to apply general principles in a way that meets your specific needs. But that flexibility comes with a hook, because what it means is that nobody else is going to tell you exactly what you have to do and give you a simple prescription that's going to work for your business. Although sector groups can be really helpful in this space, because obviously anybody in a particular type of business is going to be facing the same sorts of challenges. So likewise, the information that Emma P and I are going to be providing to you is going to be quite generic, but hopefully it will provide you some insights, but we may not be able to answer every one of your individual circumstances and queries. So in my experience, the best process that we need to follow is, first of all, understand the hazard. So actually, what is COVID? How does COVID operate? How does it transmit from one person to another? What are the kind of risks that it can present? Then we need to think about who in my business may be exposed to it and under what circumstances. And obviously that may vary between individuals. It may vary over time as to the nature of the exposure risk. Then we need to think about the likelihood of that exposure. What can we do to reduce that exposure? So these might be what we would call preventive controls, but what can we also do to mitigate the consequences if somebody is exposed to the virus, both to reduce the chances of them getting sick and passing it on to other people? We've then got to apply those controls, and this is what we've been doing for the last 2 years. We've got to monitor them to see whether they're working. Most importantly, talk to our people to make sure that what we're doing is sustainable. Because anybody who's tried wearing a mask knows that it's okay for 10 minutes, it's okay for an hour, but what's it like when you're working a 10-hour shift doing physical work? It starts to become very difficult to actually maintain that degree of focus, particularly in summer when we're sweating and perspiration's running down our face and we need to take the mask off to wipe it down. So we need to adjust as appropriate to make sure that what we're doing is fit for purpose. So some people refer to this process as the plan, do, check, act, or the PDCA cycle, which is very common for dealing with all kinds of issues in business. So it sounds easy, doesn't it? But really, you know, that's risk management 101. That's what you're almost certainly doing currently in your business in relation to other risks that you're facing. But I guess the real challenge with COVID is that our understanding of the hazard and the means of reducing its impact is rapidly changing, as are the tools available to us. So we think back 12 months ago, vaccines weren't even around, masks were in short supply. but we were also dealing with a different strain of COVID to what we're now facing with Delta. In another 12 months' time, it may be different again. There may be better treatments or different vaccines, or possibly an even more virulent strain as our borders reopen and we are exposed to the rest of the world. So the government's decided to mainly use public health legislation to control the risk to the whole population through the things that we've become used to, such as lockdowns, mask wearing, scanning, etc. However, where work creates an additional risk, it's up to the PCBU or the business to apply their duty under the Health and Safety at Work Act to those particular business-related risks. So I think the single most important aspect of this is talking to your people and getting them involved in designing how work is going to be done in this evolving COVID environment. So whether those of us who've had to adapt to click and collect rather than face-to-face, or we're having to monitor people coming into a restaurant or a store, or we're going to have different shift patterns to minimize the number of people in the office at a given point of time to reduce the density. All of these things require us to talk to our people, understand their particular needs, their particular circumstances, and try and come up with a least worst set of options. Because make no mistake, this is the new normal for the next couple of years, so we can't just keep our head in the sand and hope that it's somehow going to go away. So engaging your people isn't only an obligation under health and safety legislation, but it's a necessity, particularly given the amount of misinformation that's floating around. It's vitally important that you build trust and confidence with your team and let them feel that they're part of the solution, not part of the problem. So we know that there's general agreement amongst the medical, scientific, public health and political spheres that the Pfizer vaccine is safe and effective. But it's not a magic bullet. You can still get and pass on the virus, and you can get sick even if you've been double vaccinated, although obviously the chances of doing so and the health effects will be substantially reduced. So we can't just say we're double vaxxed, we forget about all the other controls. It doesn't work like that. So in health and safety terms, we call vaccination a mitigation control. So that's after we've been exposed. But those other controls, so barriers and screens, improving ventilation, reducing density, mask wearing, cleaning, those all still need to be part of our armory of tools. And I guess, as I'm sure you all know, you don't need to get COVID to be affected by it. So whether your business is a place of interest, whether whānau or friends of you or one of your team become infected and you have to self-isolate, or whether you're covered by some of the government restrictions, it all impacts on the business. So we need to have contingency plans in place for each of these scenarios, because we know that they can happen almost out of the blue, and we don't want to be caught on the back foot. So we have to consider all of the what ifs. As vaccination is a clinical procedure, we can't force people to have it, because that's contrary to the Human Rights Act. But what we can do is to limit what people can do and where they can go if they aren't vaccinated, as long as there's a reasonable justification for doing so, and it's not discriminatory on the usual grounds of race, gender, religion, and so on. And this position has been tested and upheld by the courts as recently as last Friday in a case brought by a group of midwives, doctors, and teachers opposed to the mandate. So it is legal. And health and safety law sits on top of that and requires employers to provide a safe workplace, but to justify this based on the risk and what's reasonably practicable in the circumstances. So what I see are 4 scenarios. If you're covered by a legal mandate under public health legislation, and we know that the one for teachers and healthcare workers are coming into effect today, then obviously your staff have to abide by it. So essentially the government has done a generic risk assessment and made the decision for you. So this currently covers MIQ, border workers, healthcare, education, prison, and a few other settings. But it's possible that the government will extend this list in the coming weeks. So if you're covered by a mandate, you have an obligation to ask for evidence of vaccination status and to record this information in a safe place. Staff must be advised that declining to provide that evidence will be assumed to be non-vaccinated. And if these staff can't be redeployed to areas not covered by the mandate, then you'll need to consider redundancy. And there are new provisions about notice periods that Emma will talk to you about shortly. Then we've got the situation with workplaces that have agreed not to allow anybody in who's unvaccinated. And this includes the recent decision by Air New Zealand in relation to passengers as well as some construction companies, law firms, and the like. So if your staff need to access these premises or fly to work, then they'll need to be vaccinated. So you'll need to know their status before you deploy them. The third situation is where you determine that there is a materially increased risk as a result of your work that justifies a vaccine mandate for some or all of your staff following a health and safety risk assessment. So currently, we're relying on guidance from WorkSafe, although government has indicated that there may be a more statutory framework being established over the next couple of weeks once we go into the traffic light system. But the current WorkSafe guidance gives some suggestions as to what we should include in the risk assessment. So that considers how many people are carrying out work that comes into contact with others, how easy is it to identify them, how close is the employee carrying out the task to other people and for how long, does the work involve regular interaction with people at high risk of severe illness from COVID, such as people with underlying health conditions, or obviously at high risk of being in contact with people who may already have COVID, which is predominantly healthcare environments. And does that risk then be materially different to the general community risk? And only if that's the case, can we impose a vaccine mandate? And then the last group is where you and your workers agree that you'll have a voluntary mandate at your workplace. And this is something that you may have heard that people like Countdown Supermarkets and others in retail construction are currently consulting on. So for Countdown, while some of their frontline staff may be at increased risk and may be deemed subject to a mandate using those WorkSafe criteria, they're looking to have a common approach across the whole business, including those who are back at house, because it makes it easier to administer. But of course, regardless of what situation you're in, you should be supporting and enabling your team to get vaccinated, whether through incentives, time off, providing good, reliable information from trusted sources. We know that giving people hard, non-negotiable deadlines tends to harden and polarize views. So the sooner you start the conversation, the better. The best way to do that risk assessment is to look at groups of similar roles, as it's about the job, not about the person. WorkSafe make it clear that even if your assessment suggests a mandate may be required, you should go back and review if you can change anything about the way the work is done to further reduce the risk before imposing a mandate, as we know that that can lead to unintended consequences. But there are lots of other twists and turns and traps for the unwary in this COVID minefield that we're all facing up to. So just to summarize my key points in terms of the way forward: communicate, 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 educate, facilitate, vaccinate, negotiate, and ultimately operate. So I'll now hand you back to Emma.
Thanks so much, Mike. I think one of my key takeaways from those comments that you shared with us is really about the adaptive nature of the environment that we're in, and the real need to work and understand your customers and your staff and your community, and so many elements to take into consideration. So really appreciate it. Now we're going to hear from Emma Peterson about the legal perspective and the latest legislation. Now, Emma is the only name that I don't need speaking notes for today, but she is also a partner in the litigation team at Russell McVeigh, specialising in employment and health and safety. Emma advises on all aspects of employment law with a focus on personal grievances, management of workplace issues, and resolution of disputes. Emma also regularly advises on health and safety matters, including compliance with statutory obligations, investigations, and prosecutions. Emma has been advising a significant number of clients on approaches to vaccination in recent months. Thank you for bringing your expertise here today, Emma. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Emma. And hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I think a lot of what I have to say sort of picks up on the points from what Mike has already said, but I think it is a really challenging time to be a business owner in New Zealand, where you are navigating all of these different issues. And I think vaccination it's absolutely new for everybody, and it is a really difficult scenario to navigate, and it is, as Mike sort of already mentioned, changing sometimes on a daily basis. As evidenced by the fact that we are waiting on new legislation from the government, which could come out any day, and which may change the landscape again. So I wanted to pick up on one point that Mike made, and that's around the fact that you cannot require a person or an employee to be vaccinated. So under the Bill of Rights Act, people are entitled to refuse to undergo medical treatment, which includes vaccination. And I think it's quite an important distinction, which sometimes is sort of new for people. And that is that when we're talking about any kind of vaccination mandate, whether it be a government order or a policy in the workplace, what we're saying is that the roles need to be done by a vaccinated person, not that the people need to be vaccinated. And that if they choose not to be vaccinated, which is their absolute right, that will have or may have certain consequences for them, including in relation to their employment. So I think it's quite an important distinction, because we do see a lot of reports referring to Bill of Rights Act, that sort of thing. So as the position stands today, we sort of have two key categories of employees, as Mike's already mentioned. We've got employees covered by the government vaccination orders or mandates. So border airport workers, now the health and disability sector and education. And then we've got sort of everybody else who is not covered by those orders, and therefore it's up to the employer or the business owner to decide what they want to do about vaccination in their workplace. As I mentioned, we are expecting some new law that will come where, it could come any day. So there's sort of two key things that we're waiting on. The first is that the government has announced that they'll mandate vaccination for workers at businesses where customers will need to show vaccination certificates under the traffic light system. So obviously we have this new framework referred to as the COVID protection framework, or the traffic light system. And under that system, certain businesses, so hospitality, close contact, etc., may need to require vaccination certificates to operate in certain ways at certain levels. And so what the government has said is that they'll mandate vaccination for workers at those businesses. We don't have any more detail than that at the moment, but if you are in a sort of hospitality, close contact business, something to look out for. We're also expecting, as Mike has mentioned, a framework for this health and safety risk assessment, which will essentially formalise the position that people are currently working to. That's has been proposed to include a 4-week notice period, which, as I understand it, will be a notice period in which employees can get vaccinated before it takes effect, but will only apply if there's no notice period already agreed, or if the notice period agreed is shorter. So we're sort of waiting to see what that looks like in terms of that framework. And the guidance from the government has been that that is expected to be enforced by the end of November. So probably looking at something fairly soon on that. But if we take the position as at today, we have our employees under the vaccination order and everyone else. So just very briefly touching on the order, or those covered under the order, essentially they prevent an employee from doing their work if it's covered by the order, if they are not vaccinated and if they do not obtain their vaccinations by certain dates. There is an ability to obtain a medical exemption, which we've seen a lot of commentary about in recent days. That is now going to be a centralised process. So a doctor or a nurse will apply on behalf of an employee for a medical exemption. That application will be made to the Director General of Health, whose team will make a determination and then communicate that result back. So it is no longer the case that employers will be making those decisions. That will be a centralised process. And the guidance that has been issued by the Ministry of Health makes it pretty clear that the scenarios or circumstances in which someone will be medically exempt will be relatively limited. Related to that, we also have been advised by the government that we're expecting the AstraZeneca vaccine in New Zealand shortly. So for some individuals who were not able to get the Pfizer vaccine for medical reasons, that may also be a relevant thing to think about. So if we turn to anyone that's not covered by a vaccination mandate, employers are sort of in the process currently, many of them, of looking at their options or approaches in terms of how they navigate that in the workplace. And as Mike has said, it's not a one size fits all. Every business has different risks, different workforce, and so different processes and solutions are going to be appropriate. But if we look at the three main approaches that employers are taking, The first one is to encourage vaccination. The second one is to look at roles within the business or categories of roles and consider whether any of those roles or categories should be done by a vaccinated person. And then the third one is to look at potentially introducing vaccination as a condition of entry to a workplace. And we've again seen a lot of media coverage of that in the recent weeks. So just firstly, in terms of encouraging, I think there are a number of ways that as a business owner, you can encourage your people to get vaccinated. Communicating that you encourage and then you support vaccination can be helpful. Giving them time off to go and get vaccinated, providing them with the information they need to make an informed decision. And some employers have gone so far as to providing sort of financial incentives. So whether that be a supermarket voucher or some additional time off if the company meets certain vaccination thresholds, that sort of thing. And that can be successful in terms of getting those vaccination numbers up. So the second approach that I mentioned was around looking at your roles or your groups of roles and thinking about whether any of those should be done by a vaccinated person. And as Mike mentioned, at the moment we have some WorkSafe guidelines, which he spoke about, which helps to sort of formulate that risk assessment process. So I'm not going to go into those have already been covered, but I think really that is about looking at each of the categories of roles, working through that process and thinking about risks and how to manage those and whether vaccination is a control that you need to do that. And then the third approach, which we're seeing an increasing number of businesses going down this path, is to say, well, vaccination is a condition of entry. That might be to your employees, it might be to your visitors, your contractors, anyone that's coming onto your site. Again, it's going to be a similar process in terms of a health and safety risk assessment to underpin any decision that you're making and looking at your particular business circumstances and what is the best approach for your business. Again, as Mike has already anticipated and mentioned, the key thing is going to be about consulting with your people, whatever approach that you take, but particularly if you are introducing a vaccination policy which contains some requirements and could have some consequences for ongoing employment, consultation is going to be really key. In terms of the employment cases that we have seen coming out of the employment institutions at the moment, they have all been in relation to employees covered by the vaccination mandate, but it has been really clear that even in those circumstances, how important your process is going to be. So consulting with your people about what you're proposing, taking on board that feedback. If you have a person who either is covered by a mandate or who you have decided that the role needs to be completed by or carried out by a vaccinated person, looking at all of the available opportunities. So could you alter their duties to mitigate the risk? What other control measures are available to you? Can you redeploy them into another role? And could they work from home? Once you have exhausted all of those other available options, then you would turn your mind to termination of employment. But the process and engaging with your people is going to be really key. In terms of what information you can ask people for, there's been a lot of commentary around about this. You can ask your employees if they are vaccinated. If they do not tell you, you can assume that they are unvaccinated, but you need to tell them that you are making that assumption. You can also request proof of vaccination. If you are a business owner where your staff are covered by a mandate, then you'll have additional vaccination register obligations. But in any event, you're entitled to ask your people in order to mitigate any risks and comply with your health and safety obligations. So the one final point I just wanted to address now is the risk around discrimination. So Mike's already touched on this, and there's been widespread commentary around discrimination risk. So in New Zealand, it's unlawful to disadvantage or treat someone less favourably on a protected ground of discrimination. So for vaccinations, the key ones are going to be disability. So where someone is unable to get vaccinated due to a medical condition or religious belief. So the information that we've had out of the Ministry of Health has been pretty clear that there is a small number of people who are unable to obtain the vaccination due to medical conditions. We now have some published guidelines on what those categories are and what that looks like. So obviously, if you have someone who is unable to get vaccinated for a medical condition, you'll work through the exemption process, look at the surrounding issues, and you should be alive to the risk around discrimination. Similarly, if you have someone saying they can't get vaccinated for religious reasons, in reality, what we've seen is that none of the mainstream religions have spoken out publicly against vaccination at this stage, but it's certainly still something you should bear in mind if you have someone raising an issue. And my suggestion would be that those people are dealt with on a case-by-case basis, again, by consulting, engaging, and talking through available options with them. That was all I had to say at this point, but looking forward to chatting through the scenarios and some further questions at the end.
Great, thanks so much, Emma. And look, my key takeaways probably from that is that, as we know, changes are constant. It's our only constant. But consult, communicate, discuss, and consider options for you, your business, and your people. So really appreciate the time that you've taken to run us through that. Our next section is an opportunity for us to cover different scenarios that different businesses may be experiencing. We may address some of your questions in this section, but please remember to post any questions, don't be shy, that you may have, and we'll get Emma and Mike to answer them for you in the next Q&A session. This is called Borrow the Expert for a reason, and they are here to absolutely engage with you, so please feel free. We hope you find it helpful, and I'll hand over for our next session to Tim.
Right, we've got a bit of a scenario here. And what we've tried to do is take some of the questions that were sent in before the event and sort of mold them into a scenario or some scenarios. The first one is an owner of a small hairdresser with 5 full-time staff. Really wish I could go and see this person after 14 weeks. Anyway, so it's an industry without a vaccination mandate, and the owner of this small hairdresser is keen on ensuring her staff are fully vaccinated to give as much protection as possible, both to staff who are employees, but also the people that come in and get their haircut. But there's also the issue of employees' right to choose. What are some practical ways that you folks can suggest that someone in this situation could go around encouraging staff to get vaccinated, and at what point does the encouragement go too far?
I think I sort of touched on some of the things that are available to sort of encourage, and so then I'll hand over to Mike. But they were things like making sure people have time off to go and get their vaccination, providing them with information, facilitating that if they're not able to find the information that they need, seeing doctors, that sort of thing. Financial incentives, if that would work for your business. So, I've seen people giving Prezi cards, giving supermarket vouchers, and as I sort of briefly mentioned, having organisation-wide targets where once you hit the target, everyone gets a half day off, those sorts of things. I think with a hairdresser in particular, obviously you'll need to be watching the announcement around the close contact vaccination mandate. So definitely keep a lookout for that one.
So just building on this, what if I've got all of my staff except for one that is vaccinated, one saying no, and the others are uncomfortable working in a work environment in close contact with a non-vaccinated person? What do I do then?
Well, I think the reality is that under the traffic light system, you're not going to be able to operate until, I think, green, if you are not requiring vaccination certificates and having everyone vaccinated. If, say, we're in the green section of the traffic light system and you've got someone that's unvaccinated, it's going to be about working through your health and safety risk assessment and figuring out whether you can operate safely. The issue with a close, and Mike will have more to say on this, but the issue with a close contact business is that you are in that close contact space for greater than 15 minutes, which we know is the risk threshold. Mike?
Yeah, so look, I think the first thing is to think about the person, because not everybody responds in the same way to having a conversation about their reasons for not being vaccinated. I attended a webinar last week that was put on by the Ministry of Health that was looking at strategies to engage with different groups. So whether it's Maori, Pacifica, new migrants, people who don't have English as a first language, so we shouldn't just assume that everybody is the same and we should approach them the same. The other piece of advice was, don't start off by haranguing them, why won't you get vaccinated? Don't you realize how important this is? Because that drives people into a corner. The leadership process that seems to work most effectively is to talk about your reasons for getting vaccinated. So what motivated you and your family to get the vaccine, and not then trying to use that as an argument against the other person, but just getting them to see this as a personal issue rather than as a boss worker kind of an issue. If there are third parties who can help you in that regard, so trusted intermediaries, in some circumstances it may be a healthcare provider, in some circumstances it might be an elder from a church or a community leader, a neighbor, a friend, but again, try and think about this from the point of view of that individual and not drive them into a corner where they've got nowhere to go. Emma talked a moment ago about the AstraZeneca vaccine potentially becoming available in the next few weeks. So if people's objections, whether they're valid or not, are that they just don't like Pfizer for whatever reason, they now have a means of saving face to say, well, I'll take up the AstraZeneca. So it's not that I'm against vaccination completely, just that I prefer not to have this one. So, we've got to give people a way out as far as possible before we force them into that corner where the only alternative is to actually go down the redundancy route, which clearly, if it's a valuable employee, is the last thing we want to be doing.
Great, thank you, Mark. So here's another scenario. We're in an industry without a COVID vaccination mandate, but as a leadership team, we've decided we'll make vaccination a condition of our workplace. I want to give my team as much notice as possible. I want to do it right because I know there'll be people who choose not to get vaccinated. What steps do I need to go through to start that process? And are there any resources available that can help me with that?
Well, look, perhaps I can kick off here. I think this starts at the wrong point, because the starting point is the leadership team have decided, and now we're going to tell people what we've decided, as opposed to let's talk to our people about what kind of a vaccination mandate might be appropriate for our workplace. But again, I think, just good consultation practice says the more empowered people feel to actually shape the decision, the more likely they are to abide by it. Once we start to say, well, we've already decided, we now just have to go through a tick and flick to make sure that we can say that we've consulted with you. And Emma referred to those cases through the Employment Relations Authority, particularly one from Customs. And actually that case was taken before the mandate came into effect. And it was the extent of the consultation as well as the extent of the risk assessment, which the Employment Relations Authority deemed to be the most important thing. So I think for this leadership group, I would say that may be where we want to end up, but let's take a step back and not give the impression that it's already a done deal, and actually then start that process of engagement at the earliest opportunity. Give people time to think about it, give them the information, treat them with respect in terms of being part of what we do in our workplace rather than what you do in my workplace, and try and take it from there.
Great, thank you, Mike. I've got one more, and then there is so many questions coming, and I think we'll move to Q&A. And I think you've sort of touched on it. So we've determined in our workplace, Mike, this is another scenario, that we are happy to have both vaccinated and non-vaccinated people in our team. How can we, as a leadership team, determine what roles require a vaccinated staff member versus roles that don't? Is there general guidance available on how to split roles up, or is that up to us to decide? I don't want to get this wrong. I think it might be one for you, Emma. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're looking at the roles or the categories of roles and thinking about who should be vaccinated, it's going to be, about working through that health and safety risk assessment. and those factors that Mike's talked about, together with any that we get introduced when the new legislative changes come in to force. But really it's about assessing each category of roles, the risks around them, looking at the other controls that are available and whether that is sufficient to address the risk, or whether you know, vaccination is required. So I think it's sort of the same thing we've said in relation to other matters, but it's just working through that process and making a determination. And really it is the business that needs to make that decision, although obviously with the benefit of external guidance if they need it or want it.
Great, thank you all. I think we'll pass back to Emma. There are a load of questions in the chat, and it would be really helpful for all that are online. If there's a particular question that someone else has asked that you want to know the answer to as well, you can actually put a little vote on that question, and the more votes, the higher up the top of the list it becomes. So really encourage you to do that. Right, back to you, Emma, and you can sort through all the questions and pepper our experts with them.
I shall, Tim. Thank you so much. Look, Mike, I'm going to put you in the hot seat first, and I'm just going to take my time to read this question because it regards to our risk evaluations. So the first question for you, Mike, is the risk evaluation between staff viewed differently to the customer to staff evaluation? So for example, in the countdown model, is the risk the same internally as externally if no mandate is implemented?
Yeah, really, really great question. So in evaluating the risk, we have to look at the risk that my people present to my customers, as well as the risk that my customers present to my people. So clearly in certain circumstances where the customers are the unknown quantity, because until we get the traffic light system in place, we won't actually know whether our customers are vaccinated or not. We have to assume that a percentage of them consistent with the population in that area will be unvaccinated. And therefore, if the engagement that we have with those customers puts our staff at risk, then obviously we have to take precautions accordingly. Once the traffic light system comes in place, then it's effectively a double banger, because what we've got now for those organizations who choose or are required to demonstrate that their customers are vaccinated, they will then have to take account of that. If they are going to have open access, and obviously some essential services like a supermarket, you can't deny people the ability to come and do shopping. So most of those supermarkets will have to assume that the customers are unvaccinated and protect their staff accordingly. So definitely we have to look at both sides. In that hairdresser example that Tim was talking about, you know, obviously that's a very close contact kind of environment, potentially for an extended period for those who have more hair than I do. And in many circumstances, it may be difficult to wear a mask the whole time that activity is taking place. So obviously, you know, that is a very high risk environment, and that's why, in all likelihood, the traffic light system will mean that you either have to limit your service to vaccinated people, or if you open it up to everybody, then you'll be covered by a mandate for all of your staff.
Thanks, Mike.
Hope I got that right, Emma. The other Emma, Emma P, I get that right?
No, I'm not the legal expert here, so I will absolutely defer to Emma. But it sounded like a very pragmatic approach. And obviously, as we've said, different things for different businesses and lots to consider. Emma, I'll probably direct this question to you, and it's regarding a group of employees who work with children as part of their role. So, for example, a holiday program, so not necessarily in a school situation. Is that automatically covered by the same mandate as teachers in early childhood centres, or is there a different sort of view on a job like that?
So it won't automatically be covered. It'll be covered if it comes within one of the groups covered by the order. So it's a holiday program. So if we look at, well, I have it in front of me. If we look at the requirements for education, so it's workers who carry out work at or for an effective education service, and that's a early childhood school or a school hostel, and it includes people who have contact with children or students in the course of carrying out that work, or will be present at the education service, so say the school, at a time when children or students are present. So if, for example, it's a school holiday program which takes place at a school in the holidays and children are there, I mean, on the face of it, probably covered because it's at an affected education service. But again, this is interpretation of an order without a lot of additional information. But if you're working for a school, so essentially if you're at or for a school, working at or for a school, and you're coming into contact with children, then you'll be covered, but it's not automatic. So you'd need to look at the order, look at schedule 2, and look at the category. So it's not anyone that works with children is going to be covered. It's about the criteria that are specified in the order.
And I think that's an important point, Emma, because my understanding is that if you're a contractor who comes in to carry out work at the school, that could bring you into contact with the children. Yep. So you're the window cleaner, or you're fixing the roof, or whatever, you would still be covered. So it's not just teachers and teacher aides.
That's right. So if you're present at the school, if we're using school as an example, at a time when children or students are also present, that could bring you within the scope of the order. If you're there after hours and there are no children there, then probably wouldn't. Yeah. So there is a bit of nuance to this sort of coverage, which is why if you've got people that you think might be covered, it's really important to look at what the actual requirements are and think about whether you comply, or whether you fall within the categories.
Great.
And just so people are clear, what we're actually both referring to is the COVID-19 public health response, open brackets, vaccination, close brackets, order 2021, current as of yesterday.
Yeah.
And it changes.
Thank you, Mike. Good
Yeah.
point. And you can find that on the government legislation website. So if you put it into Google, it'll come up. And if you want to look at the categories that are covered, it's you just need to go to the bottom to Schedule 2.
Great. And I think that's an important point, and one that we've discussed as we've caught up prior to the session, about the constant of change and the fact that this is an ever-moving piece, that new information comes out all of the time. And so having access to that information that's regularly updated is really important. And I assume that that is a regularly updated document that is available. Fantastic. Yeah. Mike, I've got one for you. Where does the balance lie when looking at health and safety risk? If the available controls can keep people safe, then is it fair that everyone has to continue to wear masks for the one unvaccinated person? What about those who can't wear masks versus the rights of those who don't want to be vaccinated?
Gosh, that's
a tricky one.
It is a tricky one. So as I'm sure most people know, the requirement under health and safety legislation is to do all that's reasonably practicable. So, there isn't an absolute answer as to how far is far enough. The question that would be looked at is, was it reasonably practicable to do more? Now, based on the risk, so it's very much context specific. So if you're in a workplace which is quite large, it's well ventilated, not too many people around, then it may be appropriate not to require people to wear masks, regardless of whether the other staff are vaccinated or not. And of course, bear in mind, you won't necessarily know, unless there's a vaccine mandate in place. People don't have an obligation to generally declare their vaccination status to either their employer or their colleagues. So unless they tell you voluntarily, you won't actually know if the person next to you is vaccinated or not. So, but if you are in close contact, then obviously the risk of virus particles being shed suggests that a mask should be worn. If you have a medical exemption from wearing a mask, because for whatever reason you can't, and there are both physical and psychological reasons why some people can't wear a mask, then obviously the business should be thinking about, can I move that person to a different role or a different location where wearing a mask no longer becomes necessary. So I often think about this, in the way that we might deal with people with disabilities. We have to make reasonable adaptations to the work or the workplace to take account of that. I'm not suggesting not wearing a mask is necessarily a disability, but we think it in the same terms. Is it reasonable to change things around for that person to actually give them the same level of protection as somebody else? And I think when it comes to most workplaces, that is going to be possible, but certainly very high density, close contact kind of environments, some of which might be in factory settings where you can't just move somebody to another desk, that may be more problematic. But unfortunately, the answer in all of these cases is it depends.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Really appreciate that. And I think a lot of food for thought in terms of that. Emma, can a business choose not to top up subsidies to 80% for those not vaccinated, but still top this up for vaccinated staff?
Well, it kind of depends on the circumstances, but no, because I think what we're seeing very clearly in terms of employment law arising in the COVID scenario is that normal employment law obligations apply, and that it includes paying your people, including topping up the subsidy. So there was lots of discussion around, first lockdown and subsequently about whether an employer had an obligation to top up the subsidy, for its employees. And the position at law is that you have an obligation to pay your people. And I think, there's some complicated factors around the wage subsidy with the requirement that you use best endeavours to pay them 80%, at least pay them the subsidy. So the subsidy guidance or requirements itself are a little bit different, but the position at law is that you need to pay your people.
Great, thank you. And look,
and am I right, Emma, in thinking that there's been a recent court judgment that says that if people are available to work, they still have to be paid the minimum wage?
Yeah, so we've just had a appeal decision out on that in the last couple of days, which found that people are entitled to the minimum wage for their agreed hours, even if they weren't actually working for those hours.
Great. And look, don't relax too much because I've got another question for you, Emma. Just following on, I think, from your comments around being able to ask employees if they are vaccinated during your session. We've got a question around, is it permissible to ask an employee why they haven't been vaccinated? And is their reason significant as far as what action might be necessary?
I mean, I think you can ask, but I think you just, if the employee is not willing to share that information with you, then, you're limited in terms of what you can do with that. But I think you can ask for their reasons. And what a lot of employers are doing, or what a lot of employers have done, is to go out with a survey saying, are you vaccinated? Are you intending to get vaccinated? If you are not, what is your reason? Whether employees are willing to share that with you is a different question, but actually having that information allows you to assist the employee with overcoming any barriers. So, if it's like a medical concern, then that's one thing. If it's a concern about something else, then, it may assist you to work with them to provide additional information and things. So I don't think there's any issue with asking that question. I think not everyone will be willing to front up with the explanation, but many people are,
Mike, did you
and
have
I think
anything?
so related to that is, I know people are interested in what constitutes medical exemption. And so recently the government changed the policy so that medical exemption can only be issued by the Ministry of Health, whereas previously it was by any healthcare practitioner. And because there was concern that certain anti-vax healthcare practitioners were issuing certificates to anybody who wanted them, that's now been tightened up. So as an employer, if you want to know somebody has got a genuine medical exemption, then it has to have come from the Ministry of Health. And my understanding is that they are very tight and that very few exemptions will be offered because the grounds for justifying it medically are very narrow.
Fantastic. And Mike, you were very helpful and posted a link to that web page that we just referred to earlier in the chat as well for anyone that wanted to access that as well. So just thought I'd point that out. Fantastic. Thank you for doing that for us. Do either you or Emma have any view on why the government isn't allowing testing as an alternative for those that don't want to be vaccinated, such as what Air New Zealand is allowing for customers and also most overseas countries?
have an opinion. I don't know if it's a view. So look, something that I think is a trick that we've missed in New Zealand is embracing what's called rapid antigen tests. So these are tests which can be administered by anybody and which give a result within 15 minutes. And if they're used regularly, say a couple of times a week, are believed to be as reliable as doing a one-off PCR test, which is the one that's currently seen to be the gold standard with the swab up the nose. And there is a trial going on at the moment because a number of businesses got together and lobbied the government to be able to do rapid antigen testing. And I'm hopeful that as a result of that test, we're going to see it much more widely available, because I think it does two things. Firstly, as we've said, vaccination doesn't stop you getting COVID. So vaccination combined with periodic testing in the highest risk settings is the best way of identifying somebody who may be asymptomatic. So in other words, they've got COVID but don't know it, but could be at risk of spreading it, particularly to vulnerable people. And then the other thing is that it provides an alternative for people who aren't vaccinated. I understand that government may not be wanting to make that available now because it might reduce the pressure on people to get vaccinated, but I would think, I'd be surprised if within 4 to 6 weeks' time, we don't actually have wider availability of those tests, whether it's included as an alternative in the mandate or as an addition, as Air New Zealand are requiring, I think is still very much an open question. And obviously it will take quite a while to get stocks of appropriate test kits out there and people knowing how to use them.
Emma, did you have any other view or a complementary view or anything else you'd like to add here?
I'm not really. I mean, I agree with Mike, and I think overseas, you know, the prevalence of this testing it's so easy to access. So it is, you know, an available option, whether it's required or whether it's something that you can just, you know, if you're going to an event, you have a test before and it's really straightforward and easy. I mean, I guess testing doesn't do everything. I mean, I'm no medical expert, don't get me wrong, but testing doesn't do everything that vaccination does in terms of, you know, decreasing spread. But I think it is a really good additional control. So I agree with Mike. I think we'll have it in New Zealand, but maybe not as a replacement for vaccination because it's a different control measure.
Yeah, no, fantastic. One of our guests has said, Emma, hi, I was surprised to hear about the religious exemptions for vaccinations. How does that process work and how common is it?
So there's no religious exemption process under the vaccination order. So what I was talking about was discrimination risk around, you know, protected characteristics. And one of them is religious belief. So there's if people are covered by the vaccination order, there's no religious exemption, it's only medical. But there is this provision in the Human Rights Act and the Employment Relations Act, which says that you can't treat someone, you know, unfavorably because of a religious ground, but there is an exemption or an exception to that where the accommodation doesn't unreasonably disrupt your business. So what I would say, if you're a business owner and you're trying to introduce some kind of vaccination requirement, or you're encouraging vaccination and you've got someone saying, oh, well, I can't get vaccinated on religious grounds, just sort of be aware of that additional risk and deal with that person, sort of engage with that person and find out exactly what the concern is, etc. Because I think at the outset, when we were starting the vaccination process in New Zealand, there was a lot of talk around religious objections to vaccination, but actually what we've seen, as I mentioned, is that there has been no mainstream religion that's come out and said we're anti-vaccination. So I think it's probably more of a theoretical risk. So really what I'm saying is if you have someone that's saying, well, I can't get vaccinated on religious grounds because my religion is whatever it might be alive to it. Doesn't necessarily mean that you change what you're doing, but just, yeah, be alive to the risk or the fact that that's there. Yeah.
Mike, anything to add there just before I
No, I absolutely agree with everything that Emma said there about that. It's sometimes used as a justification, but it's not generally valid.
Great, fantastic. So Mike, we use remote subcontractors around the country, servicing products in homes and corporate offices nationwide. What's our position in making sure these subcontractors are vaccinated and requiring proof of vaccination?
Okay, so a number of the things that we've been talking about up to now have revolved around employment relations legislation, which obviously applies between an employer and an employee, but don't apply between a principal and a contractor. So as long as a condition that you're imposing on a contractor is not discriminatory, the kind of things that Emma was talking about earlier on, there's no reason why you can't say to your subcontractors after a certain date, we only want you to provide people to carry out our work who are vaccinated. In fact, we've seen this already on a number of major construction projects where the client or the principal contractor has made that as a determination. So you are able to do that. And my understanding is that you don't have to be subject to the same requirements in terms of having done the health and safety risk assessment, because effectively what you're doing is to impose a condition in a contract for services rather than an employment contract. Now, obviously, if that's changing the terms of that contract, then under contract law, civil law, you may have to make sure that those terms and the way you're doing it are fair and reasonable. But that's a civil matter rather than under health and safety law, which is criminal law. But I'll defer to my legal colleague.
I agree. You can require it subject to what commercial terms you have with the other party.
Fantastic. And we're broadly speaking here. And so I know that if we have certain businesses or for example, the guests that asked that question, if they're looking at that, you would advise them to seek out specific advice from a trusted expert, wouldn't you, to help assist them with updating their contracts and engaging in those types of things?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. So Emma, we're not mandated, so this is the business in question, and have 90% of employees vaccinated. Can we request people who choose not to be vaccinated to get tested weekly in order to better protect our whole workforce?
So I think if you've done a health and safety risk assessment and you've decided that instead of requiring vaccination, you require testing, then that probably is an option available to you, but you'd want to have the sort of robust health and safety risk assessment in place to justify that measure. But yeah, absolutely, I think that's available, provided you comply with your, you've got a robust health and safety risk assessment, you consult with your people. It's the same sort of idea in terms of if you decide that is what you need to do to manage your health and safety risk, then you could implement that, but you'd need to make sure that you comply with the requirements along the way that we've sort of mentioned in relation to vaccination.
Absolutely.
The other issue that I think cropping up at the moment as a result of the Air New Zealand decision is the question of who pays. Because at the moment, testing is paid for by the government and it's free to users, where it's being used as a screening tool for people who are symptomatic or in high-risk groups crossing the border or whatever. I think if there's going to be a general expectation that people have to be tested before they fly or every week, to demonstrate to their employer that they're not symptomatic, then I think there's going to be some pushback from government to just writing an open check. So we may find that businesses who impose that kind of requirement may have to pick up the tab themselves.
Just sort of in a similar vein, Mike, and maybe a little bit of comment from Emma as well. Can businesses become liable for vaccine injuries? Should they mandate vaccines for their staff, which are not covered by vaccine mandates?
That's an easy one. So any ill effects from vaccination, as with any other medical treatment, are covered by ACC. So there's no liability on the employer. It's part of the no-fault compensation system. So if you have suffered a loss as a result of that, not only would it get reported as an adverse medical event, which goes into building the body of knowledge about what people are experiencing from vaccinations, but ACC would cover it for any additional medical costs or time off work, whatever it may be.
Okay, fantastic.
Agree.
One for you, Emma, and we talked about it in the scenario regarding the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is now shortly going to become available. If I have an employee who will not get the Pfizer vaccine or the AstraZeneca, but only the Novavax, how do I approach that scenario where the employee has missed the mandates but is planning to get a vaccine soon?
So there's quite a few people that appear to be waiting for Novavax vaccination, for the virus. As I understand it from what I have read, Novavax, and you may know more about this than me, Novavax has not yet actually been approved in any country. So I don't think there's any suggestion we will have it in New Zealand in the short term. So I would say if you're an employer and either you've got an employee that is covered by the vaccine mandate, or you have, as a result of health and safety risk assessment, determined that the role needs to be done by a vaccinated person, and therefore you're looking at a termination process with that person, you would not have an obligation to wait for them to get the Novavax, given that we don't know when, if it will ever be approved in New Zealand. I mean, it may be, and it may be in the future, but at the moment, we have the Pfizer and we're getting AstraZeneca, and that's all that is available to us currently in New Zealand. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just looking at the vaccination order that we were talking about before, Schedule 3 of the vaccination order determines what is an acceptable vaccination. So actually, there's a number of choices in that. So it's two doses. This is for typically people who've been vaccinated overseas, where other vaccinations are available. So 2 doses of Pfizer BioNTech, 2 doses of AstraZeneca, 2 doses of Moderna, 1 dose of Janssen, 1 dose of AstraZeneca, and 1 dose of Pfizer, 1 dose of Moderna, and 1 dose of Pfizer. So various permutations are available. If somebody started a vaccination overseas, then came to New Zealand or whatever, that's what's deemed to be vaccinated. So that's all been thought about, but Novavax is not on that list for the reasons that Emma said. It's not been approved.
Great, thanks so much for that and information hot off the website. The
advantage of having 2 screens.
Absolutely. Emma, is there an obligation to offer alternative employment? Say, for example, if a long-term manager and they work in a retail setting does not want to be vaccinated?
Well, if you are looking at going through a process with that person and looking at termination of employment, then yes, there is an obligation to look at redeployment opportunities. So if, again, you're either covered by the mandate or you're in retail, you will have done a health and safety risk assessment, and you'll be saying, well, we've determined that our storefront staff have to be vaccinated. The roles require a vaccinated person. So you work in our stores, you're not vaccinated, we're going to be therefore looking at starting a process with you. Then yes, as part of that process, you'd be looking at all the sort of alternative duties. They obviously can't work from home if they're at a store, but can you redeploy them to a non-customer facing role? All of those things. So yes, if you're looking at an eventual termination process, then yes, you'd need to look at all those things as part of that process.
Great, thank you. Maybe one for Eva. If you have some volunteers as well as paid staff, so a little bit of a mixed workforce and situation in there, would this compulsion apply to them too? And would they have to provide evidence of vaccination?
I mean, if it's a mandate, then it depends whether they're covered by the mandate. If it's your internal policy, it depends what your policy says and whether they're covered. If you've got vaccination as a condition of entry to the workplace, then yes, they'll be covered if they're a volunteer. So I think it's about what your policy says, what is required, and whether they're in scope. If they are, then yes, I think you could ask for the information as to whether if they're covered. Yeah.
Mike, did you have a view on that?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, an employer has obligations towards volunteers, and they have, a similar requirement to cooperate with the person for whom they're working. So yes, I mean, obviously, if we're talking about health and safety legislation, then if it's purely voluntary activity, where there isn't a PCBU or a business involved, then obviously the Act doesn't apply and we're just back to public health legislation. But once there is a PCBU involved that has a mixture of employees and volunteers, then they should be treated equally if they're doing similar work.
Sure, that makes sense. Look, just staying with you, Mike, what would you say are reasonable steps to enforce on unvaccinated people to reduce the transmission risk from to co-workers, visitors or customers, e.g. mask wearing, social distancing, hand washing, etc.?
Okay, so this comes back to our risk assessment. So not the risk assessment as to whether the role should be vaccinated, because we're assuming that it doesn't meet that threshold, but the risk assessment in terms of, what is the risk generally. So for me, something that's been very much underplayed in the whole COVID response up to now is ventilation. With the original variant of COVID, we believed that surfaces was the main area of risk, what's known technically as fomite. So, washing surfaces, washing hands, being careful about what you touch was seen to be, really important. That's still important, but for Delta, much more important is aerosols that are airborne and which we can breathe in. And so the biggest thing we can do to reduce the risk is not only to reduce the number of aerosols that are in the air, but also to increase the dilution factor that then maintains that as low a level as possible. So one way we can stop virus particles getting into the air is to have people wearing masks. So given that we can have people who don't know if they're infected or not, then general mask wearing means that the likelihood of us breathing out or spitting or singing or any of those other activities, particles out into the air, is very much reduced. If we're far enough away from other people, outdoors, or the area is well ventilated, then because there is an infective dose which you require to breathe in order to become infected yourself, if we can reduce that through good ventilation and distancing, then the need for a mask reduces somewhat. And obviously wearing a mask all day in an office or wherever is pretty uncomfortable. It's difficult to communicate if you're on the phone or whatever. So looking at ventilation, so a simple thing. So over my head, you can see a heat pump. Many offices will have them. A heat pump recirculates the air in the room 100%. It doesn't bring any fresh air in. So if I'm breathing out infected particles, they will stay in the room and everybody will share them. If, on the other hand, there's an air conditioning system which has a partial or complete exchange of air with fresh air from outside, then whatever I breathe out, and whether it's carbon dioxide from my breath normally or virus particles, that will get diluted and will gradually reduce over time. So I won't go on in too much detail, but there's some really good resources from the UK that I'll post in the link in a moment, which helps you to do an assessment around ventilation. And I think if you're indoors, a well-ventilated space, either windows or mechanically, and people are not literally sitting on each other's laps, then I think you can assess the risk as being such that masks may not need to be worn.
Fantastic.
Sorry, that was a bit long, but a really important issue. Yeah,
absolutely. And look, I think another important issue that has sort of surfaced is we've got a question/comment here. It would be very helpful if the government introduced a mandate for all public-facing businesses. Is this likely to happen?
I would expect no, but I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't have necessarily anticipated the government would have introduced the mandates that we have. So I don't know. Mike, do you have any thoughts?
No, I don't. I mean, there's been rumours around, various things that may or may not happen, from all public servants being required to be vaccinated to, the mandates, onto the traffic light system, covering effectively, a wider range of businesses. I suspect that was the decision that was made by Cabinet yesterday, and which the Prime Minister has said will be announced on tomorrow. So I guess we just have to wait 24 hours and see what emerges. And obviously, you know, things will continue to change. Now we know that COVID is pretty much spread through large parts of the North Island. It's only a matter of time before it gets to the South Island. You know, if we find that the hospital systems can't cope, well then I imagine that those mandates may be increased, and government will take responsibility on itself rather than leaving it to business to make individualised decisions.
Yeah, agree. Emma, for new employees,
yeah.
when we're asking them to complete application forms,
mm-hmm.
Can we ask for a vaccination status in that application form, or it shouldn't be included at a later stage?
Well, I think if you are requiring vaccination as a condition of employment, which I know a lot of employers are, then you can ask for that information. Again, you've got similar risks around discrimination if you've got particular people that are not able to get vaccinated, etc. But I think if you are making it a condition of employment, then you can ask people if they're vaccinated as part of the application process. Yeah.
Upfront. Fantastic. Thanks so much. Mike, if we're working under the traffic light system and a business has unvaccinated staff who can't work due to orange or red light, is the business required to meet full wage payments if the staff member has chosen not to vaccinate, presuming all other parameters have been worked through prior to the situation?
I'm going to pass that one over.
I thought there was a hospital pass for you.
That was a nice shimmy,
yeah, good try. So there's been a lot of different views expressed over issues of payment, which I've sort of already alluded to. The starting point at law is that if you have an employee that is ready, willing, and able to work, they are entitled to be paid, even if they can't do their job for a reason that is not their fault. And so, you know, as I already mentioned, in a lockdown situation, at law, our view certainly was that they were entitled to be paid. Some people took a different view, but that has not been supported by subsequent court decisions, etc. So this is sort of an evolving situation, but I think you're always best to start from the point that if they're ready, willing, and able to work, albeit that they're not able to, that you should pay them. However, if you've got someone that cannot work under the traffic light framework, then maybe you need to look at other options in terms of, you know, that means that you're say you're in a close contact business, or you're in hospitality, you may end up having vaccine mandates. So you may actually end up going through a process where you say everyone in our business has to be vaccinated, either because you're covered by mandate or because you're in a high risk business. And so actually you end up saying, well, you need to be vaccinated to do your job, and therefore we're going to go through a process with you. And therefore that becomes less of an issue. But the starting point is always, if they're ready, willing, and able to work, they should be paid. And that's what we're seeing come through in the decisions that we've had. One other issue that I should just touch on, which is another sort of slightly contentious employment issue, is where you are requiring someone to be vaccinated or they're covered by a vaccine mandate and you're ending their employment, what kind of termination is that? And Mike's made a couple of references to redundancy. So I just wanted to touch on that in terms of whether or not it is a redundancy. Now, again, there are conflicting views amongst the employment law community about whether this kind of dismissal constitutes a redundancy. This is novel. And so, you know, there are, as I said, a variety of views, but my view is that it's not a redundancy situation because the job is still there. If someone is not their employment is terminated because they're not vaccinated, they can't do the role is still there. The employer will have to recruit someone to do the role. So what we know is that you can dismiss provided you go through your process and you've got the justification behind you. What is not clear is, what do you call that dismissal? So is it just a sort of new category of dismissal on health and safety grounds? It doesn't neatly fall within any of the traditional categories of termination of employment, but that may be something that we see addressed in the new legislation that we're waiting on, because that may address, you know, we know that's going to address terminating employment following a health and safety risk assessment, so it may be that that's addressed. But I just wanted to touch on that redundancy point because I know there's a lot of commentary about it at the moment.
Yep, absolutely. In the workplace, Emma, are you able to publicly share the vaccination status or the fact that it wasn't disclosed to others in the organisation and even perhaps customers so that they can respond to reduce the risk themselves?
Not without consent. So if you are going to share someone's vaccination status, you need their consent. So you'd need to get that consent at the point in time at which you collect the information under the Privacy Act. But so obviously you will be advising when you collect the information, you'll say you're collecting it for a certain purpose. You should be telling your people what you're going to use it for. If you're proposing that you would be able to circulate that information within the business, you should get consent to do that.
Great, thank you. Mike, can any business determine that vaccination certificates are required for entry, or is there specific criteria?
So in terms of customers and contractors visiting your premises, then I don't believe that there is any impediment to you requiring them to show a vaccine certificate. However, I think we have to be wary of unintended consequences, because one of the things, particularly in retail, that we're seeing is a significant increase in violent and aggressive behavior when people who are, for whatever reason, reluctant to provide that information or are, clearly anti-vax, are being challenged before they go into a location. And so, with a law firm, it may be easier to say to customers and contractors, we'll still deal with you, but remotely. But if it's about challenging somebody who's coming into your restaurant and they really want to come and have a meal, there will be some people, unfortunately, who will be looking to provoke an argument. And you have to balance the protection of your staff in terms of violence and aggression with the benefit of getting that vaccination information. And I think this is one of the most challenging things that we're going to find with the traffic light system, because effectively it requires employers to become the police for vaccination mandates, and they will have to decide how far they want to push that in the context of their customer base and the nature of the interaction. Emma, I think you may have again had some thoughts about how far you can actually go to require it and refuse entry.
I mean, I think what I presume where we're going to get to is a sort of scanning situation where if you're required to show a certificate to get into a location, that you can use like a QR code equivalent. I think that's what's happened in a lot of places overseas. I mean, I think there's no getting away from the fact that some businesses are going to be requiring vaccination certificates to come onto the premises, and then that is an issue with how that's managed, but that is the way that this framework has been set up. So I think that is going to be the new normal for at least some businesses. And I think for restaurants, yes, in order for them at the early stages of the traffic light system to operate other than a contactless, they are going to have to require vaccination certificates. So how that is managed here, I suppose we can expect it will follow how overseas jurisdictions have managed it.
Or of course the consequences if you choose to call yourself a non-vaccine mandate high contact business is that your occupancy rates may be reduced. So it's not an easy decision for a business owner to make. No,
very difficult. Agree.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question is a little bit speculative and a bit sort of a fast forward, but how do we think that the vaccine boosters may work? Do we think that if you don't get vaccinated again after 6 months, you wouldn't be fully vaccinated from an employer's perspective?
I mean, I think that you would want to be following the Ministry of Health guidance on that point. I mean, I've anecdotally heard about, the vaccination rate going down after some time, and that's why I think we will be having boosters in New Zealand at some point. But I think from an employer's perspective, if you are writing a vaccination policy, you would build that into your policy. So you might say, we currently require you to have 2 doses. In the future, once boosters are recommended by the government or rolled out by the government, we may also require you, or we will also require you to have a booster at that point in time. So I think from an employer's perspective, if you have a requirement that your people are fully vaccinated, that will include boosters at the point at which they get them. And I think they're saying 6 months after, after at least 6 months until you get your booster. Mike, you might know more than me on
Yeah,
that?
that's the announcement that was made in the last day or so, is that people, you know, particularly those border and MIQ workers who were the first group to get vaccinated and some of the most vulnerable from a health point of view, they'll be eligible, I think, from 2 weeks' time to have a booster. But yes, my view is that the vaccination order, that Schedule 3 that I referred to, will be updated to say, and
a booster,
you know, at the appropriate time.
Fantastic. Another question just around employment, so I'll throw that to you, Emma, for starters. If you employ staff who refuse to get vaccinated and the work requires them to be, can they be sent home without pay, or does the wage subsidy come into play?
So if you've got people that are required to be vaccinated and won't get vaccinated, then does it say so then you would be going through a process to end the employment relationship, I would have thought, unless there's some suggestion that they will get vaccinated. So that should be on pay while you work through that process. So you'd be saying, okay, you're required to be, that your role requires vaccination, you are not vaccinated. You would work through your consultation, your alternative duties redeployment process, and they should be paid for that during that process and for the notice period.
Perfect, thank you. And maybe broadly for either of you, can we ask our students and clients, so assuming that there's a bit of a mixture in there, if they are vaccinated, they're over 16, so they don't work in the business, not legally employed, but they're coming in and obviously are students of the business?
I think you can. I can't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to.
Perfect. Mike, any view around whether or not that difference for students or clients is a little bit of a mix?
I suppose the only question would be what you're going to do with the information. So if you've got students who are over 16 that aren't vaccinated, are you going to refuse them entry? Because if you're not, then I'm not sure you've got a valid reason for asking. That would be my only thought. I mean, just a question that perhaps I can ask, Emma, is the vaccine mandate doesn't apply to tertiary education or private training establishments, does it? So workplace training?
No, I don't think it does. It doesn't fit within, that wouldn't, because the affected education institute, the affected education providers are early childhood and schools and hostels. So it doesn't appear to.
So somebody over 16 who's at a you know, a tertiary institution, a polytechnic or whatever, wouldn't be subject to, or the staff there wouldn't be subject to the vaccine mandate. So you'd go back to having to do the risk assessment, and that obviously then would have to apply to both customers, as in this case students, and staff.
I mean, I think we've seen Auckland University announce that they're going to be requiring vaccination as a condition of entry to their site. So I presume that non-vaccinated students could do distance learning. I think it's a good point. When you're collecting, I think the thing you've got to come back to is when you're collecting personal information, you've got to comply with the Privacy Act, and those requirements include having a lawful reason for collecting the data. And I think, you know, it's a good point, like, what are you going to do with it? I mean, I think you can request vaccine status from individuals if you have a lawful purpose for that and it's reasonable for that purpose. So you need the information to achieve that purpose. So I think it's a good question. What is the purpose of collecting it? What are you going to do with it? And then thinking about your Privacy Act obligations in relation to those provisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that is going to have to be our last question for this session. Look, I just want to personally and professionally say thank you so much to Tim, Mike and Emma for sharing this wealth of information with us today. You've provided some really, really helpful insights to reflect on. And a big thank you to our guests for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. If you're interested in any of the resources that we've talked about, there are some links posted in the chat, but also keep an eye on our ASB Business Hub in the coming days, and we'll make sure that we get some information posted up there as well. Ka kite anō, enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe.